Hi everyone, Broman Jenkins here. I've been doing military aviation for the last few weeks on these Let's Learn, Let's Teach videos, and I wanted to cover something a little different this week. So today I'm going to cover the Space Shuttle Challenger explosion. I know, it's a lot more depressing than usual, but I'm really interested in it. It happened a month after I was born and during my first surgery, so I have to hear about this every single year, and I figured you guys had too now. So the Space Shuttle Challenger was really notable because it was the first space shuttle to crash and explode and cause a loss of life. Now, other NASA projects had obviously crashed, especially one that ended up on the landing pad, one of the early Apollo program rockets. So the space shuttle is interesting because it can actually go up into space and come back. Boeing had experimented with space planes as early as the 50s and 60s, but we really didn't have the technology until the 70s and 80s for these things. So in 1986, on January 22nd, this space shuttle was supposed to take off. It didn't. There were issues with the secondary landing site for the next few days, and then adverse wind conditions. With something as sensitive as something rocket propelled like this that has to go into space, you have to be very sensitive to the ground conditions, the airspeed, and such things. But this kind of passed through the ideas of NASA administrators at the last few days of the launch window. On January 27th, they found that it was going to be unseasonably cold, and they asked for opinions on if they could launch the next day or not. Now, Thiokol, who had contracted out on parts of the solid rocket boosters, had told them it might not be the best idea in the world. Well, at least the engineers did. The management was pushing for this launch. And the reason was because there are 6 seals inside each solid rocket booster, and 3 of those seals are O-ring seals. O-rings are rubber objects that they can be as small as the size of your pinky in diameter, even smaller, and they can be very large too. But they seal really great. We use them all the time in aviation and on jet engines. So the idea here was that the solid rocket boosters could leak through these seals and cause massive damage to the crew compartment and to the shuttle itself. With the worst case scenario causing the solid rocket boosters to vent directly into the liquid tank that's attached, the big red tank that's attached on the space shuttles. That is liquid hydrogen and oxygen in there, and it could cause explosions and other adverse effects. NASA didn't care, so they said we're going to launch anyways. The temperatures were very cold in Florida that day, with ice accumulating all over the runway and on the ship and the docking area, and they launched. So what happens when an O-ring hits an adverse condition is that if it gets too stiff, it'll freeze and break. If you leave it out too long, it'll tear. If it's not properly lubricated when it's put into place, it could tear or get sucked out. There's a lot of things that can go wrong with O-rings, but if you design them correctly and you maintain them correctly, they'll never fail you. They're really great objects. These were not maintained or designed correctly, and that would be found out later on during the Rogers Commission, which was drawn up by Ronald Reagan to cover why this happened. Now, when this shuttle took off, a lot of the world was watching because it was the first Teachers in Space program, which took Krista McAuliffe into space. And she was a teacher from New Hampshire, and a lot of people were just interested in the Challenger mission because she was going to teach a school lesson from space. This didn't happen because after about 80 seconds, this thing blew up. Now, what happened when it blew up was that exactly what the engineers thought would happen, in that the O-ring failed, it vented air, really exhaust, into the liquid tank, and this caused depressurization of the hydrogen. It eventually lit it on fire, and because of the wind factors and other things, the solid rocket booster eventually disengaged and smacked into the hydrogen tank, caused the space shuttle to list a bit, which couldn't be compensated for, and basically the space shuttle experienced G loads that it's not able to take. It was experienced something close to 20 times normal Earth gravitation when it got knocked on its side, and the space shuttle's really rated only about to 3G. I believe 5G is a stretch as a safety barrier, but still, you shouldn't be hitting that kind of turbulence or gravitational pulls with something like that. It's very sensitive. Uh, so when this happened, it obviously exploded spectacularly over Florida. The crew compartment was later found. They were able to determine that not everyone died in the initial explosion, but because at the time there were no escape methods for a crew of a space shuttle, there were obviously no survivors. So, as I said earlier, the Rogers Commission was established out of this. They were able to determine that the O-ring was the fault. They used telemetry data and kind of put together a really good timeline that you can find out there now of exactly what happened and why. But it was basically blamed mostly on NASA because they pushed so hard to have this launch happen. In the day and even today, NASA is really driven by their schedule. They have to get these missions off at a certain time, and it has to work this way. Uh, this sort of thinking kind of fell by the wayside for a lot of years there because of how bad this was for NASA and for the U.S. government. It was really the first setback in the shuttle program, the only shuttle to crash up to that point. Later on, the Challenger would, of course, explode on re-entry, but because of a takeoff issue. Uh, this is why a lot of people say takeoff is the most dangerous part of any mission, be it military aviation, civilian aviation, or space. So I hope everyone learned something. Bye.